Imagine um, making just the biggest military blunder of the 20th century. I mean, imagine ignoring these blatant, screaming war warnings, totally misunderstanding the nature of modern combat, and basically leaving your entire Pacific fleet trapped like sitting ducks in a shallow harbor.
It's a terrifying thought, yeah.
Right. But now imagine that terrible career-ending mistake is, like the exact specific reason your country actually survived to fight another day.
It completely flips the script, on how we usually view monumental historical events.
It really does. Because usually when we look at historical sites, especially the really famous ones, there is this expectation of inevitability.
Oh, absolutely. Like it was always meant to be.
Yeah, like reading a map where the destination is already circled in bright red ink. You see a massive world-famous military base today, and you just assume it was always destined to be this grand fortress, meticulously planned by generals in war rooms from day one.
But that's almost never the reality.
Exactly. But if you're joining us today, you are probably someone who wants to understand the real, messy, layered history behind the places we all think we know without getting, completely bogged down in dry textbooks. And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive.
We are going to trace the chronological history of Pearl Harbor. And we're relying entirely on a really fascinating, comprehensive Wikipedia overview of the site's history.
Which is a great resource for this.
It really is a fantastic source because it strips away a lot of the later myth-making and forces us to look at the raw timeline.
And we're going to look at that timeline through a very specific lens today. We want to understand how early American commercial interests, so we are talking about whaling, massive trade logistics, and most importantly, sugar.
Oh, sugar is huge in this story.
Right. We want to see how those financial interests fundamentally drove the push for a military naval base long before the events of World War II even registered as a possibility.
Yeah, we're covering a lot of ground today.
We really are. We're starting with ancient Hawaiian legends, bringing it through the gritty commercial realities of the 19th century, diving into the literal engineering nightmares of the 20th century, and bringing it all the way up to, 21st century environmental crises.
My goal today is to help us look past just the dates on the page. We really need to understand the why. We want to look at how money, geography, and military strategy are so deeply intertwined that you almost cannot separate them.
So let's jump right in at the very beginning. Long before the battleships arrived, long before the concrete was poured, the original Hawaiian names for this incredible lagoon harbor were Waimomi, which translates to waters of pearl, and Puloa, which means long hill.
Those names are incredibly evocative, aren't they?
They really paint a picture.
They do. They immediately paint a picture of a place defined by natural wealth and a very distinct topography. The pearls in Waimomi actually refer to the pearl oysters that were once abundant in the pristine, ecologically balanced waters of the estuary.
Oh, wow. I didn't even realize there were actual pearls there.
Yeah. And in Hawaiian tradition, pulo wasn't just a geographic feature, it was a highly sacred, guarded space. It was regarded as the home of the shark goddess, Kahupahau, and her brother, or in some versions of the oral tradition, her son, Kahiuka.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a location literally guarded by mythological sharks. But then right alongside the myth, our source material presents this really interesting early engineering story.
Right, the story of Kiunui.
Yes, there was a powerful head of the Iwa chiefs named Kiunui. And he is credited in the tradition with doing something incredibly significant, cutting a navigable channel near the Puuloa Salt Works.
He essentially created the estuary that became known as the Pearl River, making it accessible to local navigation.
Yes, but the text is very careful to distinguish between the cultural legend and, the likely geological reality.
It is. The source notes that making due allowance for legendary amplification, the estuary almost certainly already had an outlet for its waters right where the present gap is. Mother Nature had already created the drain, essentially.
Hang on, let me stop you there. Are you saying Kiunui didn't actually dig the channel? The text is essentially calling it a myth.
Well, not entirely a myth, but an amplification.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
If you were a powerful chief and you managed to organize your people to widen or, say, clear debris from an existing natural channel to improve the infrastructure of your territory, over generations of oral storytelling, you get the credit for creating the channel itself.
Ah, I see.
The human desire to mold the specific piece of geography starts right here with him.
That makes perfect sense. He was the first public works director of Pearl Harbor.
Basically, yeah.
But here is the most crucial geographical fact that is going to shape literally everything we talk about for the rest of this deep dive. Despite this channel, despite Keanu's efforts to widen it, the harbor had a distinctly shallow entrance.
That shallow entrance is the silent main character of this entire history. I mean, it is the defining feature of the location.
Think of it like this for you listening. Think of Pearl Harbor's shallow entrance as a natural VIP velvet rope.
I love that analogy.
Right. If you were a small local outrigger canoe, you could glide right over the reef and into the club, into this beautiful, expansive, protected inner harbor.
Smooth sailing.
Exactly. But if you were a massive, heavy draft international ship, you were stuck outside. That velvet rope kept you out.
It really did.
It preserved the inner harbor for decades, keeping those pearl oysters safe while simultaneously making it this incredibly tantalizing, frustrating prize for later engineers and naval commanders who could look at it, but just couldn't use it.
It's vital to understand the broader context of what that meant. That shallow entrance wasn't just a geographical quirk. It fundamentally delayed the militarization of the harbor by global powers.
Wow, so geology literally dictated geopolitics there.
Exactly. The land dictates what humans can do, and humans spend centuries trying to overcome the land.
I want you to just imagine this for a second. Imagine standing at the edge of this shallow, beautiful lagoon in, say, the early 1800s.
Okay, picturing it.
You are a ship captain or a merchant. You look past the shallow reef, and you see this vast, deep-water inner harbor perfectly shielded from the ocean storms. You know, it holds immense strategic and economic potential.
But you can't get to it.
Right. You simply lack the technology or the manpower to dredge it, to unlock it. How often does natural geography completely dictate the timeline of human history? It's a literal physical barrier to the march of empire.
It forces patience, and it forces alternative strategies. Because in the early 19th century, as our source points out, Pearl Harbor simply was not used for large ships. The shallow entrance absolutely forbade it.
So they had to go somewhere else.
Right, so global powers had to find other ways to exert their influence in the Hawaiian Islands.
And exert influence they did.
Yeah.
Let's move into the 1820s to 1840s. This is the era of whalers, missionaries, and the absolute dawn of American influence in Hawaii.
The velvet rope is still up at Pearl Harbor?
Exactly. The shallow entrance is still keeping the big ships out, meaning the neighboring port of Honolulu is where all the action is. And the action is heavily, heavily American.
Very American.
Our source highlights a growing United States interest in the Hawaiian Islands, driven by three specific things: whaling, shipping, and Pacific trading activity.
Notice the complete absence of the word military in that initial list of interests. It is all about commerce.
That's true. It's all business.
Entirely. Whale oil was essentially the petroleum of the early 19th century. I mean, it lit the lamps of American cities. It lubricated the machinery of the early Industrial Revolution.
It was a massive industry.
The Pacific whaling fleet was an absolute economic juggernaut, and they desperately needed a safe harbor to resupply and repair.
Exactly. And the scale of this was huge, which explains why, as early as 1820, the U.S. officially gets involved at a government level. They appoint an agent of the United States for commerce and seamen to look after American business in the port of Honolulu.
And right alongside the merchants came the missionaries.
Yeah, the religious aspect is fascinating here.
It is. The commercial ties to the American continent were accompanied by the work of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. And these American missionaries, along with their families, didn't just visit.
They did?
They did. The text explicitly states they became an integral part of the Hawaiian political body.
This is where I really want to push back on the traditional narrative of how a country gains control over a territory.
How do you mean?
Well, we usually think of military conquest, right? An army marches in, plants a flag, claims the land. But that is not what happened here. It wasn't soldiers who first planted the flag. It was whalers and missionaries.
That's a very good point.
Think of it like a modern corporate takeover. You don't send the hostile lawyers first. You send the consultants and the regional sales managers. That is the 1820 commerce agent.
Oh, I see the analogy.
Then you integrate your people into the target company's culture. That is the missionaries becoming part of the local political body. You slowly, quietly become part of their board of directors.
That is a very accurate way to look at it, because what's fascinating here is we see an incredibly symbiotic relationship between commerce, religion, and eventually military power.
Because the military did eventually show up.
They did, but not to conquer. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, many American warships visited Honolulu, but look at what they were actually doing.
They weren't fighting?
No. The commanding officers carried letters from the U.S. government giving, and this is a direct quote from the source, advice on governmental affairs and of the relations of the island nation with foreign powers.
Wait. I'm struggling to see the logic here. So the U.S. Navy just parks heavily armed warships in the harbor, and the captains walk ashore to hand-deliver a letter that basically says, here's some friendly tips on how to run your country.
Yes, that's exactly it. It is a textbook definition of soft power and gunboat diplomacy.
It's so brazen.
A heavily armed warship sails into your harbor, not to fire its cannons, but to deliver advice about who you should be friends with and how you should structure your laws to favor American business. The threat is entirely unspoken, but completely overwhelmingly visible.
It is the ultimate passive-aggressive delivery system. Here are some helpful tips on governance brought to you by 80 Cannons.
Right. And you kind of have to listen to the advice.
You do. And, I also want to seed something here for later in our deep dive. We are talking about dozens, eventually hundreds of whaling ships and early warships crowding into Honolulu, right? Dumping their waste, their bilge water, their coal ash.
Oh, yeah, the environmental impact.
The pristine ecological balance of the islands, those waters of pearl, is already starting to take a hit just from the commercial presence.
Absolutely. The environmental cost of commerce begins long, long before the concrete is poured. And this combination of commerce, religious influence, and naval presence creates a massive shift in public sentiment among the Americans living there.
Which leads to a pretty bold demand, right?
It does. By 1841, there is a newspaper printed in Honolulu called the Polynesian. And the Polynesian openly advocates for the United States to establish a naval base in Hawaii.
Openly asking for a base.
Yes. But again, look at the justification. They don't say it is for national defense. They don't say it is to project an American empire. The text explicitly says they wanted a naval base for the protection of American citizens engaged in the whaling industry.
Everything comes back to the money. The military is viewed merely as a necessary security guard for the commercial enterprise.
The corporate security force.
Yes. To use our corporate takeover analogy, the board of directors is now asking for a dedicated corporate security force. And this writing was on the wall for anyone paying attention.
People were definitely noticing.
Our source notes that the British Hawaiian Minister of Foreign Affairs, a man named Robert Crichton Wiley, remarked as early as 1840, so before that newspaper editorial even came out, that, in his opinion, the tide of events rushes on to annexation to the United States.
Wiley was a very astute observer. He saw the economic and cultural gravity pulling Hawaii inextricably toward America. It wasn't really a matter of if, but when.
It makes you think, doesn't it? I want you, the listener, to consider how modern infrastructure operates today. Think about undersea internet cables or global shipping lanes or even the push into commercial space exploration.
It's a very similar pattern.
These massive expansions are almost always driven by commercial needs. First, telecommunications companies, international logistics firms, and then, once the commercial assets are in place and are, too big to fail, government protection and military presence follow close behind to secure them.
The mechanics of expansion haven't changed since 1840, only the technology has.
The flag follows commerce. It is a historical constant. And as we move past the American Civil War, that commercial imperative goes into absolute overdrive, and the stakes get much, much higher.
Right, let's talk about that post-Civil War shift. We are now looking at the period roughly between 1865 and 1868.
A lot is changing in the U.S. at this time.
A ton. The U.S. has just survived a massive internal conflict. They purchase Alaska. The Pacific states, like California, are growing exponentially in importance and population.
And crucially, the economic driver shifts in Hawaii.
Exactly. It's no longer just whale oil.
Yeah.
Exporters are desperately seeking a duty-free market for Hawaiian staples in Asian countries. Hawaiian trade is expanding rapidly.
And the military has to keep up with that expansion.
They do. To manage this vast growing Pacific sphere, the U.S. forms the North Pacific Squadron in 1865. Its explicit purpose is to embrace the western coast and Hawaii.
And they send ships out to actively survey the area.
Yes. The next year, a vessel called the Lackawanna is assigned to cruise among the islands, which the Navy officially describes as a locality of great and increasing interest and importance.
And the Lackawanna doesn't just sail around looking at the scenery. It conducts deep surveys of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, pushing out toward Japan.
And that leads to a surprising claim.
It really does.
Yeah.
As a direct result of these surveys, the United States claims Midway Island. Now, this creates a really interesting momentary distraction in our story that I want to dig into.
It does, because suddenly, midway through the 1860s, it looks like Midway might be the prize, not Pearl Harbor.
Exactly. Because back in Honolulu, American dominance is already practically absolute. Our source gives us this incredible statistic.
Oh, this number is wild.
The Secretary of the Navy writes in his annual report that in November 1867, there were 42 American flags flying over whale ships and merchant vessels in Honolulu.
42 flags.
Now compare that to the rest of the world. There were only 6 flags from all other nations combined, 42 to 6.
That ratio is staggering. I mean, it illustrates a complete, undeniable economic monopolization of the harbor.
But despite this dominance in Honolulu, the Navy report actually praises Midway Island. It says Midway possesses a harbor surpassing Honolulu's, and Congress acts on this.
So they actually put money behind it.
On March 1st, 1869, they approve an appropriation of $50,000 to deepen the approaches to the harbor at Midway.
Which, in $1869, is a highly significant investment in infrastructure. They are actively trying to build an alternative hub.
Okay, I am completely confused here. You just told me they dominate Honolulu 42 ships to 6. They basically own the local economy. The missionaries are embedded in the local government. Why on earth would Congress throw 50 grand at a completely empty, undeveloped island out in the middle of nowhere?
It seems counterintuitive, I know.
That makes no business sense.
It makes sense when you understand the difference between dominance and absolute control. Yes, the U.S. dominated Honolulu commercially, but they didn't own it.
Ah, the sovereignty issue.
Exactly. They still had to deal with the Hawaiian monarchy. They still had to deal with British and French influence, however small it was. Midway offered a blank slate.
Total control.
If they built a harbor at Midway, it would be 100% American territory, a purely American military and commercial asset without the messy politics of a sovereign kingdom.
So what does this all mean? It's like a massive corporation looking for a new global headquarters. They have their current offices in Honolulu, which they completely dominate, but the building is crowded and the local zoning laws are complicated.
Right, there's a lot of red tape.
So they look out at Midway, an empty lot. They think, hey, we can build exactly what we want here with zero oversight. They throw $50,000 at it to lay down a driveway. But ultimately, it doesn't work out.
No, it fails because of the economics.
Right. The sheer volume of their fleet, the infrastructure, the merchants, the economy, that from a 2 to 6 ratio, it creates a gravitational pull that is simply too strong.
You can't just uproot that.
You can't just pick up an entire booming commercial ecosystem and move it to a barren atoll. The money keeps pulling them back to Honolulu and the main Hawaiian Islands.
And because that economic gravity pulled them back, the role of the U.S. Navy fundamentally shifted.
Oh, so?
After 1868, the commander of the Pacific Fleet visits the islands specifically to look after American interests. But look at what the naval officers are actually doing on a day-to-day basis.
They aren't doing typical Navy stuff.
Not at all. The text tells us they served as arbitrators in business disputes. They acted as negotiators of trade agreements. They were defenders of law and order.
And my absolute favorite detail from the source: they arranged periodic voyages among the islands and to the mainland aboard U.S. warships for members of the Hawaiian royal family and important island government officials.
It is an astonishing blurring of lines between military, commercial, and diplomatic duties.
It blows my mind.
Yeah.
The United States Navy, these are heavily armed vessels of war, were essentially acting as corporate lawyers, settling business disputes, and functioning as heavily armored Uber drivers for Hawaiian royalty.
It's a great image. But it shows you that the Navy was no longer just a fighting force.
No, it had evolved completely.
The Navy became the administrative, diplomatic, and logistical arm of American commercial enterprise in the Pacific. They were providing the civic infrastructure that a purely commercial entity couldn't provide for itself.
It is a profound lesson in how power actually works. I want you to reflect on this dynamic for a moment. We often think that a country needs formal political control, like official colonization or statehood to dominate a region.
That's the assumption, yeah.
But this history proves that economic dominance almost always precedes political control. When your ships outnumber everyone else's 42 to 6, when your military is settling local business disputes, and when you control the transportation of the local leaders, you don't need to firmly own the land yet. You already own all the business happening on it.
And that economic leverage sets the stage for the intense, incredibly transactional political maneuvering of the 1870s and 1880s.
Things get a lot more direct now.
Very direct. This is when the focus snaps back sharply to Pearl Harbor itself, and the negotiations become explicitly about trading geography for commerce.
This is where the story stops being a slow corporate takeover and turns into a high-stakes, ruthless boardroom negotiation. The cash crop has definitively shifted from whale oil to sugar.
Sugar is king now.
In 1873, King Lunalilo of Hawaii is in power, and the text notes that negotiations were actually underway for the cession of Pearl Harbor to the United States.
They were ready to give it up.
But what was the asking price? It wasn't a military alliance. It wasn't a large cash payment. The negotiations were to trade Pearl Harbor as a port in exchange for the duty-free export of Hawaiian sugar to the U.S.
Which tells you everything you need to know about who was really driving Hawaiian politics at this point.
The plantation owners.
Exactly. The wealthy plantation owners, many of whom were descendants of those early American missionaries, desperately needed access to the American market without paying crippling tariffs.
It would ruin their profit margins.
Right. So they were perfectly willing to carve off the most strategic piece of geography in the Pacific just to get their sugar sold cheaply in California.
Unfortunately for those negotiations, King Lunalilo died in 1873 before it could be finalized. And what follows his death illustrates just how fragile the political situation was and how willing the foreign powers were to intervene to maintain stability for their commercial interests.
Right. March 1874 rolls around, and there is a highly contested election for the new monarch. The legislature elects King Kalakaua over the popular dowager Queen Emma.
I want to pause here because this seems like a massive escalation. The text says this election sparks a riot. Who exactly is rioting, and why does it immediately involve foreign navies?
Well, the supporters of Queen Emma were furious at the legislature's decision. They viewed Kalakaua as being way too closely aligned with foreign, particularly American, business interests, so they pushed back violently. The rioters actually attacked the courthouse where the legislature is meeting. The Hawaiian government's own forces couldn't contain it, and this is where the commercial imperative kicks in.
Because you cannot run a profitable sugar export business if the capital is burning down.
Exactly. Chaos is bad for business. So how is the riot quelled? Sailors are landed from the USS Tuscarora and the USS Portsmouth.
American troops on the ground?
And just to make sure they weren't left out of the geopolitical maneuvering, the British warship HMS Tenedos also lands a token force.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is crucial to understand why those sailors landed. Yes, the official line was to restore order, but order is a prerequisite for commerce.
The primary goal was stabilization.
The military presence was utilized to stabilize the government, specifically to ensure a favorable, predictable business environment.
And King Kalakaua clearly understood the debt he owed to this intervention. He knew his throne was secured by American and British guns.
He makes a concession.
A huge one. During his reign, the United States is finally granted exclusive rights to enter Pearl Harbor and to establish a coaling and repair station. This leads to the famous Reciprocity Treaty of 1875.
Let's track the timeline of this treaty because it is agonizingly slow. It is drafted in 1875, supplemented by a convention in 1884, and formally ratified in 1887.
It took 12 years.
Finally, on January 20, 1887, the United States Senate allows the Navy the exclusive right to maintain that coaling and repair station. The U.S. officially takes possession later that year on November 9.
But here is the most telling detail of this entire era, and it goes back to our silent main character, the velvet rope.
Ah, the shallow entrance.
Yes. Despite having the treaty, despite having exclusive rights, despite the Senate's approval, the text explicitly states that the U.S. did not fortify Pearl Harbor as a naval base at that time.
They just left it as is.
They did. Why? Because as it had for 60 years, the shallow entrance constituted a formidable barrier against the use of the deep protected waters of the inner harbor.
I am just marveling at the explicit transactional nature of this whole sequence. They were literally trying to trade what would become a legendary, world-altering military base for duty-free sugar tariffs.
It's all about the tariffs.
It's exactly like a high-stakes real estate negotiation. Hawaii had this prime undeveloped property behind a velvet rope. The U.S. wanted the property to protect its massive agricultural and shipping investments. They used tariffs as the currency to buy the exclusive rights.
And the fact that they didn't immediately dredge the channel and build the fort proves something vital about strategic thinking.
What's that?
Acquiring the rights to Pearl Harbor in 1887 wasn't about immediate practical use. It was an act of strategic denial.
Keeping others out.
Exactly. It was about making sure that other expanded empires, specifically the British, who had landed that token force in 1874, couldn't have it.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of calling dibs.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever secured an option on something, maybe a piece of land, or even just bought a domain name for a business idea, knowing full well you couldn't use it yet?
Oh, absolutely.
You didn't have the money to build the house or start the business, but you just wanted to make sure absolutely no one else got it before you were ready.
That is exactly what the United States did with Pearl Harbor for over a decade. They put a legal lock on the gate, even though they physically couldn't get their own ships inside.
It is a brilliant, long-term strategic play. To use your corporate takeover analogy again, if the 1820s was sending the consultants, 1887 was the hostile board takeover.
I've just forced the issue.
They forced the reciprocity treaty to secure their shares, locking out the rival corporations, even if they couldn't build the factory yet. But eventually the world changes, and the need for a functional, fortified base becomes impossible to ignore.
Right, and that brings us to the massive tipping point at the dawn of the 20th century.
The end of the 19th century completely rewrites the map of the world. We have the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom in 1893, led largely by those American business interests, which clears away the old sovereign political structures entirely.
The monarchy is gone.
And then, the true catalyst, the Spanish-American War of 1898. Suddenly, the United States isn't just a commercial power in the Pacific, it is fighting a multi-theater naval war across the ocean. The Philippines becomes a massive focal point.
And that changes the math completely. The desire for a permanent, heavily fortified Pacific presence to support this new global posture tips the scales. The velvet rope is finally coming down.
It's time to build.
Following the overthrow and subsequent annexation, the United States Navy officially establishes a base on the island in 1899.
And this is where the story shifts, from political maneuvering to brutal, massive engineering. Because remember, that shallow entrance is still there. From 1899 onward, the harbor undergoes a radical, violent transformation.
The dredging required to finally again the channel was monumental. I mean, they had to carve through solid coral reef to create a channel deep enough for battleships.
It must have been incredibly difficult.
The text notes the sheer difficulty of building the infrastructure. The construction of the first dry dock number 1, was an absolute nightmare.
I'm so glad you brought that up,
Yeah.
because the human and financial cost of this construction is wild. They start building the dry dock around 1909, right?
Right.
And it takes years. And then in 1913, just as they're getting close to finishing the concrete basin, the immense hydrostatic pressure from the surrounding water causes the entire structure to catastrophically collapse.
It blew out completely. All that work
Right.
was destroyed. And what is fascinating is the local response to that collapse.
Oh, this connects back to the beginning.
It does. Native Hawaiians had warned the engineers that they were building the dry dock directly over the legendary cavern of the shark goddess, Kahuka.
The protector of the harbor.
Yes. When the dock collapsed in 1913, many locals attributed it directly to the anger of the shark goddess defending her home.
Which brings us right back to our first segment, the myth and the engineering colliding head-on.
It's a powerful narrative.
The military had to completely redesign the dock, spending millions more, and it wasn't finally completed until 1919. And this period, the 1920s and 1930s, sees a massive influx of mainland workers, huge injections of federal money, and a rapid militarization of the island.
Because the geopolitical tensions in the Pacific were rising rapidly. Japan was expanding its empire, and the U.S. saw Pearl Harbor as the ultimate deterrent.
It transformed completely.
It went from a shallow, mythological lagoon to a sprawling, mechanized engine of American naval power. Millions of gallons of fuel tanks were built, airfields were paved, the pristine Waimome was fully industrialized.
Which sets the stage for the event that forever etched Pearl Harbor into global consciousness. December 7th, 1941.
The attack.
The base is attacked by Imperial Japanese Navy airplanes and midget submarines, causing the devastating American entry into World War II. Now, most people know the basic facts of the attack.
Sure, it's widely taught.
But our source highlights the specific systemic failures that allowed it to be so deadly. It wasn't just a surprise attack. It was a profound failure of imagination.
The text is very clear on this. There was no meaningful plan for the air defense of Hawaii. The American commanders, specifically Lieutenant General Walter Short and Admiral Husband Kimmel, were operating under entirely incorrect assumptions.
Hold on, I want to dig into those assumptions. How do you command the most important Pacific base and not have an air defense plan in 1941. Aircraft carriers existed. Planes existed.
They existed, but naval doctrine hadn't fully caught up to them. Short and Kimmel thought the Japanese would attack either Wake Island or the Philippines, which were much closer to Japanese territory.
So they were looking the wrong way.
More critically, the source explicitly states they had no understanding of the capabilities and proper employment of air power. They thought a carrier-based strike across thousands of miles of ocean was logistically impossible.
They were fighting the last war. They were preparing for a traditional naval surface engagement, battleships lining up and shooting at each other, not a devastating multi-wave strike from the sky.
And that misunderstanding led to catastrophic decisions on the ground.
Yeah, let's talk about General Short's decision with the planes.
Because General Short was worried about local sabotage from the Japanese-American population on the island, he actually ordered aircraft to be bunched tightly together wingtip to wingtip on the runways to make them easier to guard.
Which made them perfect, undefended targets for the incoming bombers.
Exactly. One bomb could take out multiple planes. The human cost of that cognitive bias was immense. Over 2,400 Americans died. The battleship row was decimated.
And the fallout for the commanders was severe.
Both Short and Kimmel were demoted from their full ranks shortly after the attack. The text notes that they spent years later seeking to restore their reputations and their ranks, which really underscores the heavy, enduring personal cost of leadership failures.
When your biases prevent you from seeing the real threat, the fallout is devastating and permanent.
It is.
But here's where it gets really interesting. And, this is one of those facts that makes you stop in your tracks and rethink everything you thought you knew about history.
The irony of the attack.
Yes. Our source presents a massive, counterintuitive historical irony about the attack. Are you ready for this?
Lay it out.
The text says, had the Pacific Fleet acted on the war warnings, it undoubtedly would have sortied and been at sea on December 7, where the major ships would have been sunk in deep water, making salvage impossible.
It is a breathtaking realization when you really sit with it.
Let's really think about the mechanics of this. The commanders were blamed, and rightly so, for ignoring warnings and leaving the fleet bottled up in the harbor. They did the wrong thing.
According to all standard doctrine.
But because they did the wrong thing, because the massive battleships were trapped in the relatively shallow confines of Pearl Harbor, when they were sunk, remember, they only dredged it to be about 40 feet deep. The ship simply settled into the mud.
They didn't sink into an abyss.
Exactly. Their superstructures were still above water. Because of that, the United States was able to raise them, repair them, and send almost all of them back into the war.
If they had done the right thing, if they had heeded the vague warnings, sounded the alarm, and steamed out into the deep open ocean of the Pacific to meet the threat, they would have been caught by the Japanese aircraft carriers in deep water without their own adequate air cover.
Out in the open.
Those battleships would have gone down to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, 3 miles down.
Gone forever.
The loss of the ships, and likely tens of thousands more men, would have been absolute, permanent, and entirely unsalvageable. The U.S. Pacific Fleet would have ceased to exist as a fighting force for years.
It completely inverts the narrative of failure. The very thing that made the attack so visually and immediately devastating, the fleet being bunched together, trapped in the harbor like fish in a barrel, is the exact same geographical factor that allowed the U.S. to miraculously recover from the blow.
It's stunning paradox.
If they had followed standard operating procedure and gone to sea, the loss would have crippled the Navy far beyond what actually happened. The shallow velvet rope, even after it was dredged, still saved them.
It speaks to the chaotic, almost terrifying unpredictability of history. You can make the wrong decision, a decision born of bias, ignorance, and misunderstanding, and it accidentally saves your long-term capability.
While the right choice would have destroyed you.
You can make the strategically correct decision to deploy to open water, and it results in total annihilation.
I really encourage you to think about that in the context of your own life. Have you ever had a moment in your career or your personal life where doing the conventional, accepted right thing might have actually led to a much worse outcome?
It happens more than we think.
Or a time when a massive mistake, a true failure of judgment on your part, accidentally positioned you to survive a disaster you didn't even see coming. History isn't a neat morality play where doing the right thing guarantees success. It is messy, and sometimes shallow water is the only thing standing between temporary defeat and absolute destruction.
And the legacy of that destruction and the massive industrial and military buildup that followed it through the Cold War brings us to the final chapter of our timeline, The modern era of Pearl Harbor is a highly complex mix of reconciliation, continuing tragedy, and hidden costs.
Let's talk about how the base evolved after the war. Following World War II, Pearl Harbor remained a main base for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sharing that duty with Naval Base San Diego.
It's a massive footprint in the Pacific.
And the military footprint only grew, integrating more and more into the island's infrastructure. In 2010, the Navy and the Air Force recognized their overlapping infrastructure and merged their two nearby bases. Pearl Harbor officially joined with Hickam Air Force Base to create what is now known as Joint Base Pearl Harbor-Hickam.
It is a massive modern military complex, but it is also a site of profound historical weight, which makes diplomatic events there incredibly resonant.
Like the visit in 2016.
Yes, in December 2016, there was a major milestone that the source highlights. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made a joint visit to Pearl Harbor with U.S. President Barack Obama.
The text notes this trip marked the 75th anniversary of the attack, and it was the very first official visit by a sitting Japanese leader to the harbor.
It's a very poignant moment.
You just think about the sheer weight of history this single lagoon carries. From a mythological shark goddess to sugar tariff negotiations to the grueling collapse of a dry dock to a devastating surprise attack, and now, 75 years later, serving as a global stage for international reconciliation between former bitter enemies.
It is a testament to the capacity for political healing and moving forward.
But it's not just a memorial, right?
No, the modern reality of the base isn't just ceremonial. It is a functioning, high-stress industrial environment, and that comes with modern, incredibly sad tragedies.
The source mentions a very dark day in 2019.
The text briefly but starkly notes an event on December 4, 2019, where a U.S. Navy sailor shot and killed 2 civilian workers and wounded another before taking his own life at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard.
It is a horrific reminder that behind the grand sweep of geopolitics, behind the treaties and the historical milestones, these are real workplaces filled with intense human pressures. The mental health and safety of the people maintaining this massive military apparatus is a constant, urgent reality that doesn't make it into the history books as often as the admirals do.
It's a sobering reality, and that brings us to another dark, often overlooked reality of the modern era, one that we seeded at the very beginning of this deep dive.
The environmental impact.
This raises an important question about the hidden long-term costs of the 19th and 20th century's relentless industrial and military expansion. The source reveals that on October 14, 1992, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency added the Pearl Harbor Naval Complex to the national priorities list.
Meaning it was designated as a Superfund site.
Yes.
A Superfund site.
That's intense. That designation is reserved for the most contaminated, toxic land in the entire country, requiring extensive, long-term federal cleanup. It serves as a stark, undeniable reminder that military and commercial expansion leaves physical, deeply toxic scars on the geography itself.
Think about the journey of this water. The harbor that was once fiercely protected by a shallow entrance, known reverently by the Hawaiians as Waimomi, the pristine waters of Pearl.
Completely transformed over time.
Then came the whaling ships dumping their bilge water. Then the coal ash from the 1880s cruisers. Then the massive dredging, the millions of gallons of fuel storage, the solvents, the heavy metals.
The buildup is staggering.
The harbor is now grappling with the deep chemical contamination of over a century of heavy industrial military use. The byproduct of building and maintaining a global empire has seeped into the very land the Keone once supposedly carved a channel for.
It is the ultimate price of the velvet rope coming down. When you finally unlock the geography for industrial-scale military use to protect the sugar in the trade, you inevitably poison the geography.
The corporate takeover analogy reaches its final stage. The corporation extracts the value, builds the factory, and leaves a massive environmental cleanup bill.
It is a heavy thing to process.
How do we balance it? How do we balance the deep historical reverence we hold for places like Pearl Harbor, the heroism of the sailors, the staggering tragedy of 1941, the diplomatic triumphs of 2016, with the very modern, very practical realities of environmental cleanup, toxic sludge, and mental health tragedies occurring within those exact same spaces today?
It demands that we look at the site not just as a static, frozen memorial to a single morning in 1941. We have to see it as a living, breathing, and sometimes suffering piece of geography that continues to bear the immense weight of American history every single day.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, let's take a breath and look back at the incredible journey we've taken today, guided purely by the chronological facts laid out in our source.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We started in the pristine waters of Waimomi, protected from the outside world by a shallow, sandy entrance and watched over by mythological guardians. We watched as that shallow entrance frustrated the ambitions of empires, while American whalers, missionaries, and commerce agents slowly, methodically integrated themselves into the Hawaiian political body.
We traced how the gravitational pull of money, specifically whale oil, duty-free sugar markets, and Pacific trade, drove the United States to secure exclusive rights to a harbor they couldn't even physically use yet.
They called dibs.
They did. We saw how the military acted as the logistical arm of that commercial dominance, putting down riots to ensure a favorable business climate and locking out foreign rivals.
We witnessed the tipping point of the 1898 Spanish-American War, the grueling, myth-shattering dredging of the Channel, and the devastating, world-changing attack of December 7, 1941, fueled by cognitive bias and a failure to understand new technology.
And we brought it all the way to the complex, heavily industrialized, and environmentally challenged joint base of the 21st century.
It is a story of geography, money, and the deeply unintended consequences of human ambition.
And as we leave you today, I want to offer one final thought to ponder, drawing directly on the central irony we uncovered in the text.
Lay at us.
For over 60 years of the 19th century, the shallow entrance of Pearl Harbor was viewed universally as a negative. It was a formidable barrier. It was an obstacle that frustrated American naval ambitions, delayed fortification, and forced ships to anchor outside. The military engineers absolutely hated it.
It was the problem that desperately needed solving.
Exactly. But it was precisely those shallow waters, the very geography that delayed the military's arrival and frustrated the commercial empires for decades, that ultimately allowed the United States to salvage its fleet from the bottom of the harbor after the devastating attack in 1941.
The barrier became the savior.
The obstacle prevented absolute annihilation. I invite you to consider that in the broader context of history, and perhaps in your own life. How often do our greatest frustrations, the barriers that keep us from getting exactly what we want when we want it, eventually reveal themselves to be our ultimate saving grace?
That is a powerful thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We started by looking at a map, trying to understand the jagged lines in the deep waters. But as always, we found that the real story isn't just in the geography, it's in the murky, complex, and fascinating depths of human intention. Until next time.